As we continue in worship, I actually have one more announcement before we jump into the message for this morning. So we are kicking off this weekend Team World Vision. And what that is it's a tradition for Common Grace for as long as we've been around. We've been inviting people to participate in running for a good cause. And so we partner with World Vision to raise funds that brings water, clean water to children in Africa, which is fantastic. And there's a real community sense in the running. So we have people who have run 10Ks and half marathons and full marathons. We have experienced runners and people who have never done any sort of organized running, and sometimes maybe no real running at all in their life. It's a really great and supportive community. I've done it 2 years. I'm going to be doing it again this year, and I'm excited about it. If you are looking for some extra motivation to get moving in this post-pandemic period that we find ourselves in, and would like to participate in this, we'll be running in the Kansas City Marathon in October, which I'm really excited about. There's all kinds of opportunities. And so here's what I want to invite you to do. Number one, if you have questions, you can reach out to me. I can connect you with one of our captains. I can tell you about it. But the other thing is, if you're even remotely interested, you can text Grace Runners to the number 44881. And that's not going to sign you up for anything. That doesn't commit you to anything. You can see a video and see some more information. You'll get a link back. And when you click that, you can see a video and more information and find out what's going on. And again, I would love to talk to you about that if you're interested. There's also a link in the description, and that'll take you to the same place, same video, same information. And I would love for you to explore that possibility. So actually, with Team World Vision kicking off soon, I've been running a little bit more lately, and I've always thought if running wasn't so painful, I've been really sore, then it might be more popular. That would be a key to making it more popular, I think. Getting back into the rhythm, back in the rhythm of things has left me a little bit sore. And what fascinates me about that, when I can be fascinated instead of just annoyed about it, is what's going on. This idea that muscle is actually breaking down and then rebuilding, and it's building stronger. And that pain, that process, that breaking and rebuilding actually makes things stronger in the end. And I think that has everything to do with what we're talking about this morning. So when I go running, there's this house in my neighborhood that I always notice. Now, Hope and I, when we bought our house, the very first time that we looked at it, you know how you come up with names for the houses so you can talk about them, like they do in the TV show where you're all sitting and having nice drinks, except you're just doing it in a car going from one house to the next. Well, our house, we called it Brick House. And the funny thing about that is that there's actually like 30 bricks on our entire house. But that's what we called it, and that's what we still call our house to this day. But in my neighborhood, there's this one house that's like an actual brick house. Really, it's a fortress. And actually, if I'm being honest, it looks like a brick wall with a roof on top of it. But there's this house, and some time ago I noticed that there was a crack or something in the brick that kind of ran up at this angle. And for the record, I have no idea what actually happened. I've never talked to the homeowner about this, but over the course of the next couple of years, I saw the progression just watching from the outside. And I guess I've sort of made up this narrative of what happened. And so I want to tell you this made up narrative. So I think there was this crack in the wall. And so when there's a crack in the wall of your house that looks like a wall with a roof on top of it, I guess you call somebody who fixes bricks. And so they called somebody who fixes bricks, and they came out and they fixed it, and then it was done. Except the problem was where they put new mortar in or did whatever they did, you could still see that there was once a crack because the mortar didn't quite match the rest of it. So it was like bright white, brand new, and everything else was that grayish brown, worn house. And so now it didn't look like a brick wall with a roof on top of it that had a crack in it. Now it looked like it had a line through it. And so you got the sense, and I get this honestly as a homeowner, that they maybe just crossed their fingers and said, maybe with some sun, rub some dirt on it, everything will go away, and then you won't be able to notice it anymore. So it sat for a few months and it didn't get any less noticeable. And so I think they decided they were going to do something about it. And one time I ran by and noticed that it wasn't nearly as noticeable. And so if you didn't run by it frequently, you might not even realize that it was there, say if you were just driving by or something. And that lasted for a little bit, except it didn't last much longer than that. And pretty soon you could see very clearly that whatever they had put over it to sort of mask it, to make it less noticeable, began to wash away. And and you could see the new mortar where there had been a crack in the wall of the brick house that had a roof on top of it. And so then I noticed over time something new began to happen, and they began to do something, and it looked like they were putting more mortar in. And maybe I thought, this is what you say, like, this is the last thing before we just tear the whole house down. You know, those projects, we get those. We don't know what to do about them. And so I noticed some things started to change, and then it got cold, and then I stopped running, and then I didn't notice anything until I started running again recently. And I don't know what they did. I don't know if somebody went out there with a water pick to power wash it or what, but they did something. Maybe they painted it to make some of the other mortar look more like the new mortar. And so rather than masking the new mortar, they sort of created this shape out of it. And so the house no longer looks like a brick wall with a roof on it. Now it looks like a brick wall with this diamond pattern with a roof on it. And honestly, that's a really big improvement, I think. It looks good. And I like that idea. So I wonder if you've ever heard of the idea, the Japanese art form called Konsugi. It's a practice that's been around for hundreds of years, and according to Blake Gopnik, it's something that it started something like this. Late in the 15th century, there was a Japanese shogun who had a favorite teacup that he would, or bowl that he would use, and it broke. It was from China, and so he sent it back to China to have it repaired. And when he got it back, it had these giant metal staples in it. Well, he wasn't satisfied with that, and so he got some workers, and he assigned them to figure out a better way to fix broken pottery. And what sprang forth out of that is what's now called Konsugi. And now it's not just a practical thing, it's an art form. Konsugi is a compound word that means something like golden joinery or golden seams. And it was commissioned as something to repair the broken, but as I said, it's had a lasting impact for its beauty and as an art form to this day. In the truest form, Konsugi begins with an artist trying to understand the form and the function and the purpose and the connection of the thing that they're working with, the bowl, the plate, the vase, whatever the case is. They sort of understand all of that, and then they begin to put the pieces back together. Using a lacquer or a resin, they reassemble the pieces, and then they brush the now filled cracks over with gold or silver. And what that does is it makes the cracks stand out of a white plate or something that's painted ornately. Oftentimes in colors of blue, here is this gold crack that runs through it. And it's absolutely beautiful. When they do that, it highlights the broken parts. They don't paint it to look like the original. They don't cover it up so that you'd hardly notice, but instead they put shiny gold in the broken places. The damage isn't hidden, but instead it's highlighted. Now, for us, that can seem a little bit counterintuitive. We've all heard the story. I'm not sure that it's ever actually happened, but we've heard the story of mom's broken vase, victim to an indoor football game between some rowdy brothers, in the haplessly glued back together pottery in hopes that mom will never notice. We usually laugh at those stories. Or maybe you've had a favorite coffee mug or a bowl from your great-great-grandmother's china set that's been chipped or dropped or broken, and you've perhaps somewhat tearfully you've had to part with it. But what about when it's something deeper? What about the times when this happens in our lives, not to our pottery, but to our hearts? What about when our relationships get fractured, or our faith falls to pieces, or our dreams get cracked? What happens when we lose someone that we've never known the world without? What happens when we make a misstep or a bad move or a wrong choice? Or what happens when we do that over and over and over again? Truthfully, most often we're inclined to just sort of sweep it under the rug, to bury it, to put it in a dark corner. Or we try to metaphorically dispose of it. That's the Western practice. If a vase breaks, you throw it away and you get a new one. It's just too bad. You let it go to the junkyard, preferably on the edge of town, so we don't have to look at all the trash that we've created or smell it. If we don't dump it, we like to just fix things on our own. No help, no consult. It's all going to get worked through. Or for the internal things, we shove them into a jar, put the lid on, screw it as tight as we can, and put it on the shelf of our souls in hopes that it will stay bottled up there forever. We like not to remember the fractured parts of our past. We want to pull all of our pieces, if we have to, pull them out, broken and the beautiful. We want to wipe them off, cobble them together, and then just throw a smooth veneer over the top of it and call it, well, perfect. So I have these other neighbors. I guess they didn't like their brick. I don't know if it just wasn't their aesthetic or maybe it had a crack in it, but they just painted over the whole thing. And now you can't tell if it's actually brick or just some painted PVC texture that somebody slapped onto the outside of their house. Listen, I know it's in vogue to paint brick these days, but I just want you to know as your pastor that I'm morally opposed to it. So there are a couple of unique things that I want to talk about. The reason that I'm talking about all of this, this idea of Konsugi and the ways that we handle the rough parts of life, they are for us, in this Japanese practice, the way they deal with them, it's a bit counterintuitive. And there's a few reasons for that. First of all, sometimes the repaired items won't even work for what their original purpose was. Usually they will, but sometimes the teacup won't hold tea, the bowl won't hold what it was meant to, the vase doesn't hold water anymore. And yet it's not considered wasted or trash. Then it becomes art. And to the person who owns it, to the beholder of that, it becomes a reminder of their experience. These things have sentimental values, and usually they can be restored to the purpose, but even if they can't, there's a value in what they are there with their gold lines through them. The second thing that's perhaps a bit counterintuitive to us is that even if they will work after they've been repaired, oftentimes it'd be much easier just to repair them. Why go through the months-long process that Konsugi requires when you could just pitch it, go buy a new one, and then move on with your life? Heck, you could get something that's shiny and new and clean. But that's the whole point. Speaking very broadly in the traditional Eastern perspective, as opposed to the traditional Western perspective, how most of our minds are shaped, the Eastern perspective would not be so quick to gloss over what's broken. And all this points to the last thing that feels counterintuitive to us. Konsugi draws attention to the places that have been broken. It features the imperfection. It doesn't gloss over history and the shatter and the struggle. It highlights all of it. We don't do that. We find ourselves in our life, not the least of which in the times that we are right now as we begin to emerge out of this long winter of COVID, we find ourselves asking questions like, can't we just go back to how things used to be? Can't we return to normal? Can't we just fix that, replace those things, restore whatever, gloss over the rough parts, and then just move on? Konsugi takes what's broken and highlights the fissures and the cracks. We want to shove it all away and move on as quickly as possible. But the deep conviction of Konsugi says that these things actually become more beautiful in the process. That the brokenness and the fracture and the fissure isn't something that should be covered up, but it actually adds to the beauty. It doesn't distract from the object, it enhances it. They aren't a pariah attached to the pottery, it's an essential part of the whole. And all of it becomes more valuable, more unique, more meaningful because of it. So let me tell you another story. I have this friend who used to have a piece of art up on his wall. He had a friend in a previous place where he lived who was an artist, and his friend, the artist, was testing out some things, and so he had painted this big canvas all black, and after the paint had dried, he soaked it in something and left it outside to dry as he was trying this new technique. Apparently it didn't go like he'd planned, because when it had dried in the sun, the whole canvas twisted itself really to a pretty remarkable degree. Well, that wasn't at all what he was going for. So my buddy was over at his house later that week at a party, and he saw it leaning up against the wall of the makeshift studio in his garage. And he asked his friend, "Hey, what's this?" And his friend said, "It's a piece of trash." And he said, "What happened?" And the artist explained what had happened. And my friend said, "Well, if you're going to throw it away, I want to keep it. I think it's perfect." His friend said he would think about it. A few days later, he showed up at my buddy's house and he had added some words to it. In the bottom of one corner of the twisted canvas, he had written "imperfect" with parentheses around the I am. And my buddy had moved that across the country a few times and still has it to this day. There's something in art, being able to find beauty in the midst of the messy, chaotic, broken, and busted things of the world that sometimes we're not so good in doing for the rest of our lives. Sometimes we can see it in art, but we can't see it in the day-to-day. Particularly we, as supposedly sophisticated and Western-minded people are, we sometimes just don't get it. But I think this idea of finding beauty in the brokenness, of creating art out of the cracks, of highlighting the imperfections, of putting on your wall the twisted canvas, I think all of that aligns more with God's perspective of things than our thinking sometimes does. This week our scripture is from Romans 9 to 11. Yes, 3 whole chapters. Don't worry, I'm not going to read all of it. But I want to tell you the gist of what Paul is saying. And so I'll begin just with the beginning of chapter 9 as we go through this. Paul basically introduces this by talking about this agony that he has in his heart. He says, "I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. For I wish that I myself could be accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my own people, my kindred according to the flesh." What is he upset about there? What is he so worked up about? What is wrong? The problem is that Paul is a Jewish person. He was a zealous Jew, and then he was converted to the Christian faith, and he wants nothing more than for his fellow Jewish followers of God to be converted as he has been. And so he has this anguish in his life. Let me pick up from verse 4. "They are Israelites, and to them belong the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the law and the worship and the promises. To them belong the patriarchs. And from them, according to God's flesh, comes the Messiah, who is over all, God blessed forever. Amen." So he says they have all of these good and beautiful things, and yet I want them to understand this. I wish that they could. What Paul is wrestling with through these 3 chapters is about Israel's role. The central question is about Israel's role in God's plan of salvation and the salvation of Israel itself. But the larger question, as we've been talking about from the very beginning of Rome, is about God's righteousness. Will God remain true to God's promises to set all things right? Has God's plan of salvation been derailed because not all of the nation of Israel has accepted the Messiah? This fact that not all of Israel has accepted the Messiah is what grieves Paul so greatly. That's why he talks of sorrow and anguish. It's because there are brothers and sisters, his fellow Jewish followers, who haven't accepted Jesus as the Messiah. In his estimation, later in verse 16, he says, they haven't accepted yet the salvation that depends on not on human will or exertion, but on the God who shows mercy. And then later in verse 30, he says this, Gentiles who did not strive for righteousness have attained it. That is, they've been made righteous through the faith, and likely that means the faithfulness of Christ, what Christ has done. But Israel, who did strive for righteousness that is based on the law, did not succeed in fulfilling the law. Why not? Because they did not strive for it as on the basis of faith, again, likely meaning the faithfulness of Christ, but as if it were based on works. And so then Paul moves forward in chapter 10 and begins with this, brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer to God for my Jewish neighbors is that they would be saved. And indeed, he has hope in that. Verse 5 begins talking about how salvation is available for all. And verse 12 says, there is no distinction between the Jew and the Greek. The same Lord is Lord of all and generous to all who call on him. So jumping ahead to question 11, we see this question coming to a head beginning in verse 1, and I'll begin reading there. I ask, then, has God rejected his people? By no means. I myself am an Israelite, descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. And then jumping ahead to verse 5, so too at the present time is there a remnant chosen by grace, but if it is by grace, it's no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. And jumping down to verses 11 and 12, so I ask, have they stumbled so as to fall, meaning his Jewish brothers and sisters? By no means, but through their stumbling, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous, not as if stumbling. Now, if their stumbling means riches for their world, and if their defeat means riches for Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? The heart of the matter is God's righteousness. Has God abandoned the Jewish people in the plan to save the world? By no means, Paul will say. Even if some do not yet recognize Jesus to be from God, God's righteousness, God's covenantal promise, all of that remains. So, if we were trying to put this in language about our everyday lives, we might ask it this way. Does God's righteousness go null and void when we fall short? Does Christ's faithfulness stop when we fail to live as he commanded? If we don't recognize the Spirit at work in our midst, does the Spirit stop working and stop showing up? Again, as Paul would say, by no means. In Romans 9 through 11, we encounter this long and specific example of an everlasting and often repeated truth. God does, by grace, turn us and our works, yes, even our failures, into goodness and glory. Our faithfulness doesn't make Christ unfaithful. Our failure doesn't make God untrue. In fact, Paul will say, God has taken rejection from within the chosen people and used it to accelerate the vision of including all of God's children. The Gentile mission has been moved forward in the face of all that is for Paul a grievous reality of the failure of all in his community to accept Christ. And if, as God does, looks at the cracks, if we look at the broken pieces, the twisted canvases, if we look at all of that from God's perspective, I think what we say is we might hear God saying, now there's something that I can work with. God isn't interested, like we all too often are, about sweeping everything that's shattered and uneven and unkept under the rug. Jesus has no need to slap a veneer over the rough parts of our histories to make us okay. In fact, God is far more likely to use what's fallen apart and piece it together to form beauty and grace, highlighting those realities, than to brush them away. Do you remember back when we began this journey through Romans? I think it was week 2. We talked about Paul's introduction. We talked about Paul's hope that his readers' faith would be proclaimed throughout the world. And then the next week, we read in verse 16 of chapter 1, for I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the good news of salvation. And I told you that one of my hopes for this series is that we would come to terms with our faith, our experience of salvation, our understanding of God, and we might share it with others, that we would come to know our own experience and be able to tell others about it unashamed. I think our reading this week invites us to do the same, to tell our story, what in traditional churchy words we would call a testimony, simply meaning a statement of God's work in our lives. That if we could tell that story about how God is faithful and has been faithful, that might be a fruitful practice for all of us. And to tell our story doesn't mean to tell how we've got it all together now or how we've always had it all figured out. It doesn't mean to say that we've always understood exactly what's going on and where we're heading and what's happening around us. That's not real. That's not authentic. That's not who we are. And by the way, friends, that's not compelling. What is compelling is to tell the stories that are honest about our broken places, to name the places where we felt alone and out of place or abandoned, confused, and twisted, to tell about those places and tell about how God, through friends, through family, through faith, through any number of things, how God has helped guide us to a carefully, intentionally, and artfully mended place of being. Not some facsimile of what used to be, but instead something new and more beautiful for the wearer. And when we have the courage and the strength and the wisdom to share that story, friends, it's then that we contribute to the riches of the world, that we invite others to see the goodness of God's story. So the places in your life right now that feel fractured or fragmented, where you're trying to smooth everything out to be clear as glass, God isn't interested in pretending it didn't happen. Instead, God is interested in mending it together and making your story, making your truth even more beautiful than it was before. That's how God works, and our struggle won't stop God from being one who is consistently turning mourning into dancing and giving beauty for ashes and turning shame into glory and graves into gardens and bones into armies and making a way when there is no way. Friends, that's who God is. We may want everything to be symmetrical and smooth and perfect, to pretend that the rough parts didn't happen. God wants to fill our cracks with gold. I'll end with this in just a second. Chad's going to play a song that tells this truth beautifully. In fact, I quoted it just a second ago. He introduced me to this right before Easter. And if I'm honest, I probably listened to this song more than any other since then. It's called Graves into Gardens. And it captures the beauty of this God who brings life out of the mess. That's who God is. Remember that, friends. No matter our shortcomings or our failings, no matter our wandering or our wondering, no matter our heartache or our hang-ups, God is in the business of mending us together and making all things new. It's the consistent witness of the Scripture, and it's a part of each of our lives. So where, friends, has that happened in your life? Where is it happening right now? Let's take a few moments to reflect on that.